Now, today we're going to continue talking about church planting, and especially because God has chosen the church to be one of the major instruments for world evangelization. Well, if you're going to be a missionary, you are by necessity have to be involved in planting new churches. And contextualization is really key to understanding what it is you're trying to do. Now, if you were in the course with me when I was teaching church planting, there's a difference between starting a church and planting a church. There's a lot of people who go out and just start churches. They haven't crossed any cultural barriers. They're not trying to reach a different segment of society. They're trying to reach people like themselves. They're angry. There's been a church split, and one group goes over and starts a church across the street. That's not church planting, okay? That is church starting. Church planting is where you have a target group in mind. There's a unreached segment of society that is not being reached with the gospel, and you want to reach that segment of society with the gospel. Well, if you're going to do that, you're going to plant a church. So one of the things that we want to do is talk about contextualization and kind of define that a little bit. Contextualization is simply the attempt to effectively communicate the gospel and the kingdom ethic to others in such a way that they may understand and place their faith in Christ and become a fruit-bearing disciple in a local church. There's several key elements in this definition. It is an attempt to notice effectively communicate the gospel. Now, beloved, if you want to get on a loudspeaker and you want to pass out pamphlets in English and speak in English, you can certainly do that anywhere in the world. But if you're in a country where English is not their native language, then that is not the most effective way to try to preach the gospel. So you've got to figure out, how are you going to not change the message of the gospel, not change the message of the gospel, but somehow put it into a context where the target group has a chance to understand and place their faith in Christ and become fruit-bearing disciples. There's another way of saying it, okay? You can say it this way. Christian contextualization can be thought of as the attempt to communicate the message of the person, works, word, and will of God in a way that is faithful to God's revelation, especially as it's put forth in the Holy Scriptures. That is meaningful to the respondents in their respective culture and their context. In other words, in a way that they can understand it, in a way that makes sense to them, that you're speaking the same language, that you are communicating the irreducible elements of the faith and the gospel in a way that they can relate to it in their own culture. Sometimes we call that the flavor of the church, okay? And there are some things that bring about the flavor of the church. Number one, and most important factor, is the biblical parameters. And you've heard me use this phrase a lot this week. The irreducible minimum. What does it take to be a church? What are the essence of a church? Do you have to have pews? No. Do you have to have a lectern? No. Do you have to have a choir loft? Do you have to have a choir? Do you have to have musical instruments? Do you have to have hymn books? Do you have to have a roof over your head? Do you have to have 4 walls? Does it have to be a permanent structure? So you've got to figure out what your preferences are and leave those behind and figure out what is the biblical parameters for there to be a church. What is the irreducible? I mean, you can't get any more basic than that. Now, is it okay to have a choir loft? Certainly it is. Is it okay to have pews? Certainly it is. But you don't have to have those in order to have a church. Can you have a church meeting in a prison? Absolutely. Anywhere there's a group of baptized believers who meet for the purpose of worship, fellowship, teaching, service, witnessing. Yeah, you can have a congregation. It can be in prison. It can be out back underneath an oak tree. It can be in a pine thicket. It can be in an oak grove. It can be among the mango trees. It can be in a tent. It can be in a barn. It can be in a storefront. It's the body of believers that is important, not the physical locations. There's a second factor, and that is the culture or cultures of the people. What is their worldview? What is their musical style? What is their dress? The communication methods, the structures, the organizational shape of the local church. It needs to be their flavor and their way. For example, in ministering to the Madi people in northwestern Uganda, you need to learn their culture. You need to understand who they are and how they worship. And one of the things that you will learn quickly is they are not time-oriented. They are event-oriented. You say, well, every event needs to start on time. Well, that's because you're time-oriented. There's a time for Sunday school to start. There's a time that it ends. There's a time that the worship service begins. There's a time that it ends. So we are time-oriented. The Madi people are event-oriented. If the event of the day is church and we're going to worship on Sunday, then worship begins when the first few members of the congregation arrive at the meeting place. And they will start by singing songs. Now, they may sing for 30 minutes. They may sing for an hour and 15 minutes. They may sing for 2.5 hours. And one of the reasons why they sing is because people are not time-oriented, which means they don't wear watches, they don't have clocks, and the event of the day is church. So they sing to allow their voices to drift through the airwaves and alert people that church is beginning. So they will sing long enough until they think everybody has arrived. Like I said, it begins when the first 2 or 3 members get to the meeting place. Whether it is under the mango tree, whether it's in the schoolhouse, whether it's in the church building, or whether it's just under a awning or a tent that they have erected for the purpose of worship. And they will sing. Well, If you're in a culture that is event-oriented and not time-oriented, you might as well not look at your watch, because your watch doesn't hold any value. Now, that's their culture. They are event-oriented. Their worldview is, this is what we're doing today. It may be the only thing we're doing today. It doesn't have a start and stop time. It is the event of the day, and we're all going to share it together. So you have to understand their culture, what it feels like to them, their music style. They are very energetic. They love to sing. They're very talented. There's almost drums in every church and shakers in every church, and they are active participants in worship. They all sing. So the choir may sing a special or several special songs, but if anybody in the congregation knows those songs, then everybody in the congregation is invited to sing with them, because they're all participating together. It's not disrespectful, okay? It's not mass chaos. It is just a different culture. So you need to understand that, and a church is going to take on their flavor. How long is the pastor going to preach? Well, again, they are event-oriented, not time-oriented. If the pastor wants to speak for an hour, that's okay. If the pastor wants to speak for 2 hours, that's okay as well. If he wants to take the whole afternoon and go 4 hours, that's okay too, because they are event-oriented, not time-oriented. The third factor in looking at the flavor of the church is the cultures of the church planters. Well, let me say that again. The third factor is the cultures of the church planters. Now, as I've said before, we try to make sure that we are planting a church that looks more like their culture than our culture. And you have to be very, very careful of bringing in items from your culture into their culture. One of the first pastors' conferences that I held over in Uganda, I held in a place in the West. It was among the Ruankoli people out west. And we had about 200 pastors there from not only Uganda, but also in Congo, down in Rwanda, Burundi, Tanzania, and of course, Sudan. Well, you had all these different cultures there. You had different countries represented there. But most of them were wearing a suit, some of them three-piece suit, ties, and dress shoes. Now that struck me as odd, because that's not their native dress. That's not what they wear to work. That's not what they do business in. So I asked them the question, why are they all wearing suits? And they said, oh, well, that's what the missionaries always wore when they came to preach. So we thought this is our preaching costume. Well, do you see the problem with that? You don't need to wear a costume to preach, to share God's word. I purposed in my heart right then not to wear a suit when I preached. I wanted to dress as they would dress on an average every day. Now, they do have forms of dressing up. You can wear a katanga, or you can wear a consul, you can wear, something else, a safari suit. And I have those, and I do wear a katanga, and I do wear a safari suit. I do wear, but it's the styles of that country, of their culture. In the African mind, I would be very dressed up. I would look very smart. I could wear those things to meet the president of their country. So we have to make sure that we don't wrongfully flavor that new church with a culture that is so different from theirs. Okay? So we're going to talk about that for a second. How do you understand the people? Well, I've given you some helpful hints here. First of all, you need to understand them geographically. What makes these people geographically different? Again, I'm going to go back to the Madi people in northwest Uganda. They're in the area that is known as West Nile. Moyo district lies west of the Nile River. The Nile River begins in Jinja, Uganda, and flows south to north. It empties into the Mediterranean Sea. It takes water about 3 months to go from Central Africa, there in Uganda, northward and empty into the Mediterranean. Well, because they are on the west side of the Nile River, there is no bridge that crosses the Nile River in Moyo district. So there's only a ferry. Now, how does that make them different? Well, geographically, there are people who were born and reared in West Nile who have never crossed the river into the other part of Uganda. They've never seen any other part of Uganda than the Madi people on the west side of the Nile River. Now, they've crossed the border into South Sudan, they've crossed the border into Congo, they've come south, but only as far as the river. So, geographically, they are distant from everyone else. It's going to take you about a 45-minute boat ride to cross the ferry to get into the West Nile area or the district of Moyo. It's going to take you that long. You may have to wait in line 4 hours to get your 45-minute boat ride, but that lets you understand the people a little bit better. You say, how does that help you understand? Well, goods and services are higher because it takes longer to transport them up there. It's more expensive to transport them up there. And they were so isolated that most people don't import things that are not necessary. So you only get the bare essentials up there. Demographically is another way to understand the people. How many Madi people are there? Well, there's 1.2 million Madi people in that West Nile area. They're not the only people there, but they're the largest tribe in West Nile, even though when you compare them to all the other tribes, the Basogas, Bugandans, the Ruankolis, Acholis, they're not the largest tribe. So demographically, you need to understand who they are, what kind of people they are, basically farmers, that kind of thing. You also need to understand their culture. Now, to a Madi person, honor means everything. If someone is believed to be a liar or a scam artist or a thief in any way, shape, form, or fashion, then the tribe shuns them for 4 generations, which means they don't want their children or their grandchildren or their great-grandchildren or their great-great-grandchildren to marry anybody in your family because you're a liar, a cheat, a thief, and that means you have bad blood. And we don't want to mix our blood with bad blood. Okay? That's their culture. Another part about their culture is they are very family oriented. And they believe having the most children that you can possibly have is the greatest thing, because in a way that's kind of their retirement mentality. The more children you have, the more people there are to help take care of you when you get old. So that's a cultural thing. For you to go in there and say, well, statistics tell us that you're better able to provide for your children if you only have 2 children. Well, that is culturally offensive to them. They would never accept you saying some foolishness like that. You also need to know them spiritually. You need to understand, are they animist? Are they Muslim? Are they nominal Catholics? Are they something else? You need to understand their culture. Basically, what is their culture? What does their culture believe religiously? Because that's their fallback position when you start asking them spiritual questions. They will tell you what they've been taught, what is culturally acceptable. So if you're going to minister to them, if you're going to reach them, then you need to know what that means. All this is part of learning how to contextualize the message of Jesus Christ. Historically, who are they historically? Several years ago, there was a man named Joseph Kony who led the Lord's Resistance Army that did great atrocities all over Uganda. They killed thousands upon thousands of people. And Joseph Kony claimed that he could not be killed because he represented the Lord. Personally, the atrocities that he did, there was absolutely nothing godly or spiritual about him. However, Joseph Kony wreaked havoc in that country. So much so that it left a scar on the collective psyche of people in Uganda. I went to an orphanage one time, and they were so excited because we were about to put up a concertina wire around the top of the fence around the orphanage. And I thought to myself, man, it's going to look like a little prison because we got, a 10-foot cyclone fence with razor concertina wire around it. And I got to sit down and I got to talk to some of the students there. And they were so happy. I said, why is this making you happy? And they said, oh, Kony and his men don't like concertina wire. It makes it harder for them to break in and steal us. We're going to sleep so much better because of this wire around our orphanage. So you see, you have to understand historically what has happened. What have left these scars on this culture? What history has helped mold them? Believe it or not, beloved, we're finding out that this pandemic has caused some psychological difficulties especially for the children. Another area to help you contextualize is politically what's going on. Again, we'll go back to Uganda. The current president is a man by the name of Yoweri Museveni. Museveni brought in a form of democracy there. Before Museveni, if there were an election in Uganda, the winner killed the loser and all of his family. And that's what they knew politically. So whenever there was an election, people were highly on guard because they thought there was going to be a major bloodletting after the election. Museveni has not done that. And he's been reelected for 7 terms so far. But that's part of their political understanding. And the other thing we need to talk about is linguistical. You need to learn their language. You need to, on day one, start learning some words or phrases to let them know that you are there to minister to them as a people group. Not that you're trying to get them to change from who they are into little Americans, but that they have value in God's eyes in the language to which they were born. And your learning their language helps them do that. You, even on day one, begin to understand basic greetings. Hello, thank you, goodbye. Anything that you can learn will be of great benefit to you. Okay? So all of these things are ways that will help you contextualize your message. Well, if you're going to plant churches, you need to understand how churches grow. Okay? Really, there's about 4 ways. One is we call it expansion growth, and that results from basically 3 sources. 1, a congregation leading people to Christ, and then grow that way, expand. 2, believers transferring their membership. Now, remember I said there's a difference between church starting and church planting. Anybody can go out and start a church, especially if they start with members from other churches. There's been no evangelism. There's been no expanding the kingdom, but believers have transferred their membership from one place to another place. Okay, that's part of expansion growth. There's a third way to have expansion growth, and that is by the children who are being born to the members. And that's called biological growth. Now stay with me. A church ought to grow biologically by 3% every year. If you're not baptizing or reaching more than 3% of your Sunday morning attendance, then you're not even reaching the people you've already got. Because biological growth should be at least 3% if you're a normal, healthy church. So that's one way churches grow, is by expansion. Another is internal growth. That's like increasing spiritual maturity, or expanding the campus, building new facilities or bigger facilities, or adding on. That's internal growth. Then there is extension growth. And this happens when the church begins to plant other churches in their own culture. It is people trying to reach people like themselves. They have a church, in this 5-block radius, in all directions, and then they go 5 blocks in another direction, and they plant another church. Just like them. It's in the same community. It's the same everything. That's extension. They begin to plant other churches in their own culture. And then the fourth way churches grow is bridging growth. This happens when a church begins to plant a church in a different culture. It may be slightly different. It may be vastly different. So bridging growth would be a church here in America who wants to start or plant a church in Uganda. They pick a team and they send them over to Uganda, and they help them establish a new church among the Ugandan culture. It could also be an Anglo church in inner city wants to plant an African American church in the inner city, or an Indian church, or a Pakistani church, or a Hispanic church. You are bridging your culture and another culture. Beloved, if we're going to reach the world, then we have got to be strategic in us planting churches, not just starting another church because we're mad at somebody, but intentionally planting churches so that we can reach the world with the gospel of Jesus Christ.